Welcome to Nobilis Erotica, the best science fiction and fantasy erotica anthology podcast in the known universe. This month, Heroic Persuaded Straight Impregnation. This is episode 478. I am your host, Nobilis Reed. Our author, Sarah Ellis, is a science fiction and fantasy fan who wrote her first short story when she was 7 and never stopped. She's written games for Steve Jackson Games and Iron Crown Enterprises, nonfiction for Boydell and Brewer, and erotica for Circlet Press. She lives in Western Massachusetts. Our narrator is Dee Reed. My wife has been politely requesting to participate in the podcast for a long time, and when this story came up in my feed, I decided to indulge her. This is not the most professional narration I have featured, but permit me please this small indulgence for someone who has been a constant source of encouragement and support for many years. If a few clicks and rustling of pages would bother you, feel free to skip it. This one is a love letter to my lovely wife. This episode is sponsored by Literotica, the world's most popular online community of self-published erotic authors and readers for over 20 years. Check out their Adult Creators podcast at literoticapodcast.com or find it in your favorite podcatcher. Here we go.
The Place Where Heroes Are Made. Written by Sarah Ellis. Narrated by Dee Reed. I recognized him the moment he walked in the door. Oh, not that I knew him, of course. I never do. But the heroes, the new ones at least, there's always something about them that I can spot all the way across the common room. It's the look in their eyes that marks them. The seasoned ones are grim but determined, calm almost, even those with the darkness filming their auras like scum on soup that's too old. Those who've just learned their destiny are every bit as determined, but until they actually face danger, they're as soft and fresh as a new opened flower. That's how I spotted him. Young and pale under his tan, with a well-worn bow slung over his back and a brand-new sword at his hip. He was with old Scrooby and his band, passing through on their yearly quest to the Falud Mountains in search of mountain peacocks. They haven't found one yet, but it hasn't stopped them from going back every year or so, and who's to say they won't show up one of these days with a bird the size of a horse in that wheeled cage they haul about every campaign season. It's cost Scrooby an eye and Deshane her left pointer finger, but thank the gods they haven't lost a comrade in years. Deshane noticed me by the bar and waved in greeting. She wore new armor, which meant they'd found a patron this season and would be able to pay instead of running up a tab. I waved back and crooked a finger at Scylla. She glanced at the door, smiled when she recognized Deshane, and smoothed her apron and her cap before bustling over. Her apron was a finger or two higher than normal, but otherwise her condition wasn't showing. She's always been a bit stout, and better that she serves them than one of the other girls until I could learn a bit more about the newcomer than his age and his choice of weapon. The bard coming through from Remstown struck a chord on his harp, and soon enough most of the room had joined in as he sang a ballad I've heard him do 100 times. Scrooby pulled out the reading glass he swears makes up for his lost eye and ordered the same roast mutton and new cheese he always does, with plenty of ale and the freshest bread you have, my dear. His lucky meal, he calls it, and who am I to say otherwise? He's alive, and that's more than I can say for some who pass these doors on their way to adventure. Another party came in while I called out the order to the kitchen staff, and another. These were everyday folk. Drovers walking new calves to the high pasturage, farm wives with eggs and cheese for sale the next morning, a caravan headed into Dravos with silk and spice and wine for the quality. I knew most of them and they knew me, and it was easy enough to fill up the tables and assign rooms to this group and that. I'd done it so long it's natural as breathing. More folk came in just as the bard finished and sidled up to the bar for another cup of cider and a bit of gossip. I listened with half an ear as he told a story about the king's latest favorite getting into a screaming fight with a girl who was determined to replace her, when the door opened and a group of 5 came in. This time it was soldiers, 3 men and 2 women. The officer, the older of the women, made a face at how crowded the common room was and made as if to go back out into the night. I wasn't sure I blamed her. There's a caravanserai near the edge of town that caters to the army, and they'd have room, like as not, without having to scrabble. We were full up, and I wasn't going to displace Scylla and her sister Rilla from their room so close to Rilla's time. My brother Dalin frowned slightly at the breeze from the door, then broke off flirting with Goody Petra and headed over to the soldiers. I wondered why. Dalin's had his eye on Petra ever since her husband broke his leg and took to his bed, and he makes a point of serving her whenever she comes in for market day. What was he doing? That's when the officer took off her cloak, and I saw the God's mark shimmering around her like a thin golden flame. I raised an eyebrow at Dalin, who gave me a half smile but didn't break stride. He always takes the women, at least at first, and I take the men. Most we pass along to the youngsters, but always we make time to speak with them ourselves if they're new to these parts. Some are under vows, you know, or have a family waiting at home. It's best to know these things before making a move. Mother taught us that before she ever let us do more than carry out the flagons, just as her mother taught her, and hers before her, back to the first of our line. It doesn't matter as much with the boys, but why should one of our girls waste herself on a man who's already thrown a child or two? This one was a touch old to have the aura, but I'm not one to question the gods. If they'd picked her as one of their chosen, Dalin would know what to do. If we were wrong, he'd know soon enough. I slid a final pint across and eased off from behind the bar. The young archer had barely touched his food, and damned if that waste of skin Scrooby calls a teamster wasn't trying to steal the boy's portion for himself. I fixed the teamster with my best mind-your-manners look, and waited for him to turn to his own bowl before sliding in next to the young one. "Is the food not to your taste, young master?" I asked, keeping my voice light and friendly. "I can have me girls fetch something else if you prefer. There's soup if you like, or porridge poached in wine if you'd like a sweet." He flushed crimson and hung his head. "It's good enough, Mum. I've no appetite tonight." The teamster grinned and elbowed their animal trainer in the ribs. "He's scarce eaten in 3 days. He'll never—" The shame kicked him under the table hard enough that he pulled a sour face. I've never told her why I chat up newcomers, not in so many words, but she's been through once or twice in the winter when I've been big, and she can count backwards as well as any. "Leave him be, Shadlin." "But—" She stood up, one hand on his shoulder to draw him up with her. "I feel like a game of center and squares before I sleep, and you're the only one who can play worth a damn in this lot. Come on." Scrooby rolled his good eye as she pulled Shadlin toward the locals chucking darts at a scarred section of the wall. He scooped up the last of his stew with a hunk of bread, nodded to me, and then shooed the rest of his party over to watch. He can count, too. I kept my peace until they'd gone. The archer had managed to finish more of his meat, and was making a dent in the cheese. "See? I knew you'd like it if you gave it a chance." He went even redder, but answered well enough. He wasn't quite as young as I thought, though it was hard to tell with one as fair-haired as this. "It's good, mistress." "Cayley. Just Cayley," I said. This close I could see the aura flickering about him, the dark red gold of one destined for great and perilous deeds. "And you? I haven't seen you here before. Is your home in the city?" "Nay, I'm from the Fox Hills." His shoulders relaxed a trifle. "I'm called Malik. Deshane knows my sire from years back and asked for my service. She says I'll do well enough when we hit the mountains." "I dare say she's right. She's a fine judge of men." I smiled as I spoke, laughing to coax a little smile in return. "Stick with her and you'll be fine. She's brought Scrooby back time and again, and him nearly knowing which end of a sword is which." Malik had to chuckle at that. "A scholar he may be, but Scrooby is no hand with a weapon, and he knows it." "I hope you're right, Miss Cayley. Scrooby promises riches, and he may be right, but all I want is enough to set myself up once I'm on. My girl—" He blushed again. I patted his hand, keeping it friendly for now. "That is, she's not mine, not yet, but I have hopes. Her father said not to speak to her until you had gold enough in your purse, I finished. It's the same everywhere. Parents wanting their children secure before they pair off. If she's meant for you, she'll be there when you return. I hope so. He looked past me at the wall. The butcher's son comes round too much for my liking, but until I've spoken... I gave his hand a squeeze. There were archer's calluses on the fingers, thick enough to tell me he'd been drawing a bow since he was scarce old enough to walk. Go on, there's no shame in thinking of her, you know. The dart game was getting loud enough so that no one heard us as I drew it all out of him. His girl, his home, his dreams and hopes and wishes. He was scarce 20, this one, and frightened to his marrow by what might happen once they hit the trails. And although I told him the truth about Deshane taking care of her people, he'd heard the stories about what awaited in the mountains, especially high up where those damn birds of screwbees are supposed to nest. Malik was no fool, and I couldn't find it in me to give him false assurance. His aura was too ready for me to be sure he'd come back in one piece, or even at all. One by one, the other patrons left the common room and headed upstairs to sleep, 2 or 3 to a bed, or off to their own homes if they lived in a village. I said nothing as Dahlin waited by the door for the officer as she saw her soldiers off to their billet, and then guided her to his own room when she returned, pausing to take her arm when she hesitated. Young Malik didn't seem to notice Scrooby and Deshane heard their lot to their usual quarters at the top of the back stairs. I was glad enough of that. What came next needed privacy, and the gods know there's little enough of that in the Wayside Inn. Scylla's twin Rilla waddled in to bank the fire when the room was quiet, rubbing her back as she pushed herself upright from the hearth. The midwife says it would be any day now, not that I couldn't tell from how low her belly had dropped this week. A girl, Rilla said, almost certainly a mage like the adept who'd passed through here last autumn on his way to the university. And a good thing, too. Mages have been scarce since the last war, and the more we can breed, the better. Malik stared at her as she lumbered past to bolt the door, Scylla and Jen and the rest trailing behind as they gathered up mugs and trays and plates from the tables. Should she be working right now? She knows what she's doing. I let my hand drift up his wrist, lightly tracing the veins and tendons. Not much muscle on this one, but strong enough for all his leanness. Rilla's done oughter work this close to her time, and all's gone well. Don't fret on her account. His eyes dropped to the table. I meant no harm. And did none. I leaned toward him, edging my chair a bit nearer. This close I could almost feel the doom hovering over him, tarnishing the sign of the gods. You have a kind heart, Malik. There are too few of those in this world. I try, he murmured, blushing again. Your mum always said that whatever else I did, I should think of others. Kind, strong, still innocent enough to ask after a woman with child, but marked for danger, in love with a girl he hadn't dared approach. There was a scrape as Casimir, the prettiest of my cousins, pushed a chair back under its table. She had barely finished her blood time for the month, and Jen beside her was nursing her latest. With the twins both pregnant and Jen taking this year to rest and build her strength, that left only me. Your mother taught you well, I said, keeping my voice for his ears only, as I pressed my thigh against his and let my hand travel down his throat to the lacings of his tunic. You are as worthy as you are handsome. His eyes widened, and that pretty flush spread across his cheeks again at my touch. I waited for Rilla to pull the door to the kitchen shut. Mistress, I told you to call me Kaylee, I whispered, and before he could say another word, I drew his lovely young mouth to mine and kissed him, long and sweet and slow. His lips parted a fraction, but before I could slip my tongue between them, he pulled back with a gasp. I didn't. No, you didn't. It was easy, almost too easy to shift myself from the chair to his lap. He was only half hard, and this not a surprise in one so young. I did. I'll do it again if you like. His eyes were a deep, soft green, touched with brown in the depths. They widened as I deliberately cradled the back of his head and drew him down for another kiss. You can't. Why not? I'm slimmer than most my age, but birthing 4 fine younglings has given me bosom enough so that he couldn't help making a little sound as he drew his hand to my bodice, and guided his fingers to cup and cradle and tease. I bit back a sound of my own as he ran a careful finger around me nipple. Why do I always forget how good these calluses feel when I'm longing for a man? I think you could stand a little pleasure before you hit the road, my friend. He shuddered, and I felt the full hardness of his prick against my thigh. My girl at home, I told myself I'd be true, that I'd wait. You haven't spoken to her, I breathed into his hair. He gasped as I tugged lightly at his earlobe with my teeth. The gods tell us to comfort each other in the night and to keep the watch against fear. Let me comfort you for this one night. We've only just met. His free hand stroked the line of my jaw, worked my cap free so that my braid fell loose down my back. His breath was warm and somehow sweet from something that wasn't fruit poached in wine. You can't know. I set my feet on the floor and held out my hand. I can and I do. Relief spread through me as his aura lightened to pure gold, and then the green that augured well for a coupling. Yes, he was for me, this proud, frightened young hero. More than you could ever know. He closed those beautiful eyes for an instant, then took my hand in his own. I think you have the right of it, Kaylee. I picked up the last candle and led him to the door of my private room, to the great bed that my mother had led my father to when he got me on her. It was older than my mother or her mother, and heavily carved with warriors and archers, soldiers and adepts, women slender as maidens and round as ripe fruit. My aunt always said she could see the little figures come together whenever she kindled, but I'd never seen more than wood dark with age, even on the nights when I'd lain with the gods marked, so that they might not go childless into unknown lands. Blush he might as I undressed him, but it was clear Malik was no virgin once he had my clothes puddled around my feet. No, for all his talk of keeping faith with his girl, he had no problems kissing his way down my neck and shoulders, to my breasts, then down to the bottom of my belly. I was already wet when he settled down on top of me and ground himself against me, and I didn't have to pretend my own pleasure as he bit my neck and suckled my breasts until my nipples ached in his mouth. And if he was surprised when I rolled him over and paid him in kind with kisses and nips and licks, it wasn't long before he moaned and thrashed on my pillows as I worked my way down his chest and ribs to a stiff, eager cock. It was beautiful, long and firm and thick enough that I had to breathe long to take it deep without choking. Malik whimpered and began to thrust as I sucked and nibbled and licked my way up his shaft from root to tip, tracing the great pulsing vein past the foreskin to the moisture welling from the slit. His whole body shook with the effort of holding back, and I nearly took pity on him and let him spill on my hands and mouth. Not yet, I told myself. You know better. As close as he was, I wasn't sure he'd last until I had him inside me. I swirled my tongue down his length one last time to keep him happy, then wrapped my fingers about the base of his prick and squeezed hard enough to hold back his release. He gave a great gasping cry that was more than half frustration. So close! Gaily! His belly heaved under my cheek as he fought for breath. I loosened my grip and waited for him to soften enough so that I needn't fear the waste of good seed where it would not bear fruit. We have all night, I murmured, flicking my tongue across the thin, sensitive skin at the hollow of his thigh. No need to rush. His hands caught in my hair as if to guide me back to his member. I laughed and shook out the last few pins, letting it swish across his chest and throat. His eyes widened at that, and before he could speak, I knelt over him and kissed him again, this time letting my tongue sweep past his to explore the soft wetness of his mouth. Soon he was doing the same to me, and it was so good I almost forgot why I'd brought him to my bed in the first place. Movement from the side caught my eye as he rolled us over at last and thrust his hand between my legs to spread my nether lips. Something flickered on the bedpost. Was it one of the little women mounting a man? A youth taking a nymph from behind, prick upright and dripping as he shoved it into her again and again until she screamed with delight? Or just a trick of what little light there was. I shuddered as he slipped a middle finger inside me. The heel of his hand pressed against my mound and swept it about until he found the place that made me buck and thrash against him. He clamped his mouth over mine to swallow up my moans as I reached the peak for the first time, his tongue teasing mine in rhythm with his fingers dance in my channel. I clawed at his shoulders and arched up against him, body aching to be filled with flesh and seed that would leave me round and ripe as the oak and nymph above us. I managed to pull back enough to grin up at Malik and guide his dripping fingers through my thatch across my belly to my hip, then grasp that beautiful cock in my hand and rub it lightly against the slick wet of my cunny. He grinned back, his free hand cradling my head so he could kiss again as he began to move forward. "Now?" he whispered, lips hot against my own. His eyes were completely green now, as green as the aura that surrounded us. "Now!" I gasped and rose to meet him as he slid inside me, right where he belonged. I've lain with many a man in my time, most for simple pleasure, but 4 times before Malik I'd done it for a reason. Tonight was like those 4 other nights, when pleasure had coupled with need to keep alive something more than the memory of the brave and the doomed. I'm not ashamed to say that I had to blink back tears as he shifted about until his cock rubbed against that little nub between the legs that brings women joy and began to work in earnest. My pleasure peaked again as he ground and thrust and rocked with me, and I'm sure he called me beautiful once or twice. There was nothing between us now but the eager, desperate need to forget tomorrow's danger and sweat and skin and heat. I drew it out as long as I could, but there's only so much a woman can do with a young and eager man. Green gold light flared around us as he gave his final cry and drove deep, and my own cries mingled with his as his essence filled me. I didn't need to see his aura flare like the summer sun to know that the gods had blessed us indeed. Sweat filmed his brow as he lowered himself onto my breast, and I smiled at how peaceful his young face was now. I rubbed my cheek against the top of his head and sighed his name, even as I shifted beneath him to keep him inside me as long as possible. Let him have nothing but good memories of this night and of me. "Thank you, Kaylee," he said. At last, his voice soft and wondering. He had tried to hold back a yawn, but when did a man ever not wish for sleep after plowing and planting? You were right. I needed a woman's comfort tonight. I stroked his hair as his breathing evened into sleep, and I was there to give it. I lay awake as he slept in my arms, only working free to use the chamber pot after I'd counted enough time to let his seed find its mark. My thighs were sticky and hot, and I couldn't hold back a sigh of relief as I did what I needed to do. Malik didn't stir as I drew on my shift and headed out to the common room. He'd wake sometime in the night, and I wanted to have wine and cakes ready to feed his other appetites before we came together again. Dahlin waited by the bar, just as he always does when I've taken a traveler to my bed. His hair was starting to gray at the temples, but by the glow of the night lamp he could have passed for the youth he'd been when our mother took her place with the gods, and we were left to run the hero's rest. "Well?" I asked, easing myself onto a stool. Malik had ridden me hard. Hard enough that I took my time to settle into place. "What does she say to your offer?" He drew a pint of good, rich stout for me. "She's leaning towards it. Said he's been thinking of asking for her womb leave for the last 2 campaign seasons anyway. Well, she's still young enough that the bearing won't kill her." The drink was rich and savory, just the way I like it. Rilla and Scylla truly were the best brewers on the Crown's Road. "She's waiting until her return?" "Of course," he said a bit too loudly. "She wants an honorable leave while she's bearing, not a court of honor for getting with child on campaign. She'll decide for good and all when she returns." "Good. We haven't enough women with skill left after that last battle." Dahlin shuddered and made an avert sign. "Our armies had won the day, but oh, the cost!" "Did you read her God's mark?" "Don't I always? It's not as if I sent her back to her troops without—" He snapped, wiping foam from his lips and turning away from me. I remained perfectly still until he calmed. It wouldn't do to rouse the inn with a quarrel so late at night. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. I raised my hand, and I shouldn't have asked. You know what you're doing, just as I do. He had drunk half his flagon before I spoke again. What did you sense? She'll come back this time, but her luck is running out. At most she'll have time for one child, two at the outside, before she goes to the gods. He shrugged as if it were only business. She'll have to find a man at home for the second, of course, but she seemed pleased at the thought of heading into winter quarters with the first one planted. My poor brother. Always the sentimental one. Our mother tried to warn him before he got into the business, but Darlin never was one to listen. When would he stop falling in love with women who only pass through on their way to somewhere else? I can't think of a better man to give her such a gift, I said, laying my hand on his wrist. He managed the ghost of a smile. And you, sister? Your young archer seemed sprightly enough when you sat down beside him. Oh, that he was. I stared into the coals glowing in the great hearth. Darlin was not the only one who had to be careful of his feelings. Almost too sprightly. He fears he won't come back. Will he? I don't know. I tried not to think of how red his aura had been when we chatted in the common room. His way would not be easy, whether it led back to the Fox Hills or an early grave. He has a girl back in his home village. Normally I wouldn't spoil him for her, but after what I saw in his light, new life forming in my depths, carrying on his name and his blood. I hadn't realized I was rubbing my belly the way I do only when I'm with child, until I saw my brother raise an eyebrow. I couldn't take the chance, Dolan. I couldn't. He may not make it to another summer's eve, but his child, or his child's child, will need this blood sooner than later. He narrowed his eyes. You're not young, Kaylee. Are you sure you shouldn't have sent another? Cosme's from a line of archers and wizards. 'Twould be a good breeding. I shook my head. She wouldn't have caught tonight, and they're heading out in the morning if I know Scrooby and Deshane. I'm still young enough for this child. Barely. First the sickness, then my waist getting thick the way it always does, then the quickening low in my womb as my belly starts to swell. No more after this one, though. I turned the thought over in my head and didn't find it unpleasant. This would be my fifth, and wasn't that enough for a young woman? Maybe it was time to step aside, for younger women to do the hard work while I ran the inn and kept the books. Cosme can have a pick of the next party that comes through. I'll be too busy finding fosterage for the ones that will come this year to care, I'll wager. Darlin smiled back, then wrapped a strong, familiar arm about my shoulders and kissed the top of my head. We may have words from time to time, but we're a team, we two, and ever will be. Go back to bed, Kylie. I'll keep the watch for us both. He always knows what to say, my brother does. Thank you, I said. Do you know where Ellis put the cakes? I've a mind to have a surprise waiting when young Molly wakes. In the buttery with a bottle of thread. He gave me a gentle push toward the stairs. Go, before he wakes. I did as he bade, making up a tray with dainties for two. Malik was still asleep when I pushed the door open, curled on his side with my bolster crushed to his heart. He looked younger than ever, and I wondered why Deshane had agreed to take him without a season or two on campaign. There's a small table by the bed, beside the bedpost that's supposed to tell the story of our line. How my 4 times removed Gran decided that it was damn shame for our best and bravest to waste their lives on quest and battle, with neither chick nor child to carry on their name, and founded this inn so there would be a place for them to read, where none would ask a question. I think it's nonsense. The bedpost, not the story, that's true enough. But it's a fact that the women carved into the worn old wood look more like my family than one might think at first glance. I uncorked the wine and poured 2 glasses so it would be ready when he woke, then pulled off my shift and climbed in beside him. He murmured my name and pulled me close, one hand tangled in my hair, one resting where his child would grow. I guided his head to my shoulder and whispered that nonsense that women always whisper after a night of love. Perhaps he'd dream of his girl, safe at home where the worst she'd have to fear was a runaway horse or an overflowing kettle. The floor outside my room creaked as Dallin made a final check of the first floor. He and young Iris would start the porridge before dawn, and by the last cock crow, I'd be up to help. By the time Scrooby and Deshane and their followers came down to break their fast, Malik would be up and dressed and could pretend he'd slept with someone besides the innkeeper. I'd watch them eat, ask the gods' blessing on them all, and try not to read Malik's aura as he walked out the door. He stirred in his sleep. I stroked his long, fair hair until he calmed. He'd be a hero before long, if he could find the place in himself where heroes are made, and if the gods willed it, he'd be back in the fall. And if they didn't, your blood won't be lost, my friend. You have my word on that. We slept.
And that's our story. This episode is sponsored by Literotica, the world's most popular online community of self-published erotic authors and readers for over 20 years. Check out their Adult Creators podcast at literoticapodcast.com or find it in your favorite podcatcher. If you'd like to get an ad-free version of this podcast, head to patreon.com/nobilis. As a supporter, you will have access to a personal RSS feed that you can drop into your podcatcher. And if you want monthly bonus content, bump up your support to $3 a month. And finally, remember to pick up Monster Whisperer Second Class in your favorite ebook retailer or on the Riverdale Avenue Books website. Or pick up the audiobook on Audible, Amazon, or Apple. Your support will help ensure this series continues. You have been listening to the Nobilis Erotica podcast. Theme music is composed and performed by Mass Relay. This podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Until next time, listen hard.